In 1847, immigrant ships sailing to America were typically recorded as carrying between 200 and 400 passengers, though many were severely overloaded and exceeded legal limits. The grueling transatlantic voyage typically took 5 to 8 weeks, lasting anywhere from 45 to 60 days depending on the weather and route. The term coffin ships was given to these vessels because of the staggering death rates, with up to 20% to 25% of passengers dying on board from starvation and diseases like typhus and cholera. Here are the specific details of the journey. While some ships carried around 200 people, others were crammed with upwards of 400 to 600 passengers to maximize profits. These numbers were often double what the vessel was legally allowed to carry. The crossing to ports like New York or Canadian stations like Grosse Ile typically took 5 to 8 weeks. However, certain conditions could stretch the journey out to as long as 3 months. Passengers were packed tightly into dark, damp and unventilated holds, with meagre food rations and poor access to fresh water. Many victims were buried at sea, while thousands more perished in quarantine stations upon arrival. The following is based on a diary discovered in an old tenement building in New York under floorboards during demolition in the 1960s. While the author hasn't been fully authenticated, it appears to have been written by Michael O'Sullivan and his wife, who emigrated from Ireland in 1847 on an immigrant ship bound for New York. There have been some alterations for some undecipherable wording and for details that were too difficult to understand, but the story is held true to the account therein. This isn't a happy story, so don't expect it to be, but a truthful account of what immigrants at the time endured in order to begin a new life here in America. Week 1. The wind had barely filled the sails when Michael O'Sullivan stood at the rail and watched the green hills of County Kerry slowly disappear into the morning mist. Mary held little Mary Jr. against her shoulder, while Brandon, 10 years old, and Sean, only 7, leaned between the ropes for one last glimpse of the only home they had ever known. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Behind them lay empty potato fields blackened by blight, abandoned cottages, and neighbours who had simply vanished over the past 2 years, some to fever, some to hunger, and other to unmarked graves dug hurriedly in rain-soaked ground. Ahead lay America, or so everyone hoped. The ship itself inspired little confidence. She was an old timber merchant vessel, hastily converted to carry emigrants. The paint peeled from her hull, the rigging groaned in every breeze, and the smell of damp wood mixed with salt and tar hung constantly in the air. To the owners, every emigrant represented another fare collected. Comfort had never entered the calculation. The family was assigned a narrow wooden berth deep within the hold. Calling it a bed would have been generous. 2 rough planks projected from the wall, barely wide enough for Mary and the children to lie side by side, while Michael kept curled against them to stop himself rolling onto the floor whenever the ship pitched. Around them, dozens of other families crowded into identical spaces. The hold was barely tall enough for an adult to stand upright. By nightfall, every inch of floor was occupied. Babies cried, old men coughed until dawn. Someone prayed aloud, someone else quietly sobbed. The darkness swallowed every sound until they blended into one endless murmur. Each family had brought whatever possessions they could carry. Most owned little more than blankets, a few cooking utensils, spare clothing, and perhaps a treasured family Bible wrapped carefully against the damp. Michael's greatest possession was a small carpenter's plane tucked safely into his sea chest. "If America gives me timber," he had told Mary before they sailed, "it'll give me work." She smiled every time he said it. Someone had to believe. The ship's daily ration was announced on the second morning. Each passenger received hard ship's biscuit, salted meat on certain days, oatmeal, a little flour, and a measured allowance of water. The biscuits were harder than stone. Brandon discovered that if he struck one against the timber post of their berth, it sometimes cracked into smaller pieces. When Mary soaked them in water for several hours, they often softened enough for little Mary Jr. to chew. Even then, they were often alive with tiny weevils. The first time Sean complained, Michael simply picked the insects out with his fingers. "They've crossed the sea before us," he joked. Sean laughed. Mary did not. Fresh water quickly became everyone's greatest concern. The barrels had been filled before departure, but sailors knew from experience that stored water seldom remained fresh for long. Within days, it developed an unpleasant taste. Within weeks, it could become foul. No one dared waste a drop. Bathing was unthinkable. Drinking came first. Cleanliness became a luxury no passenger could afford, and by the fourth day, the smell below deck had become almost unbearable. More than 300 people shared the confined space. There were no proper lavatories for those packed into the emigrant hold. During calm weather, passengers were encouraged to use simple privies suspended over the ship's side, but rough seas often made them inaccessible or dangerous. At night, many relied on buckets or chamber pots, which quickly filled and had to be emptied whenever conditions allowed. When storms prevented access to the deck, waste remained below among the sea passengers. The odour seeped into every blanket, every piece of clothing, and every breath. Children sometimes missed the buckets altogether. The youngest could not always wait. There was simply nowhere clean left to stand. As the week wore on, sickness began appearing among the passengers. At first it seemed harmless: a child with a fever, an elderly woman unable to keep food down, a man weakened by diarrhea after days of vomiting. Most believed they would recover once they reached America. Few understood how disease spread. Doctors of the time knew little of bacteria or viruses, and the passengers knew even less. They shared cups, shared spoons, shared blankets, shared air. People slept shoulder to shoulder, breathing one another's breath through the long nights. Lice spread instantly from person to person in the crowded quarters, carrying diseases such as epidemic typhus. Contaminated food or water could spread dysentery, while poor nutrition left many people too weak to fight even minor infections. The hold itself became an ideal environment for illness. Dark, damp, poorly ventilated, overcrowded. Every cough found another pair of lungs, every fever another body. Michael noticed one sailor refusing to enter the emigrant hold longer than necessary. He tied a cloth around his nose before descending the ladder. "Bad air," another passenger whispered. "They say it's the bad air that kills." Michael nodded politely. He had heard the same belief all his life. The passengers could smell the foulness, so naturally they assumed the smell itself caused disease. Modern medicine would later show that the true culprits were infectious organisms spread through contaminated water, food, lice, and close contact, but in 1847 that knowledge was still decades away. On the seventh evening, Brandon climbed quietly onto the deck with his father. The Atlantic stretched endlessly in every direction: no land, no birds, nothing except grey water beneath a grey sky. "Are we halfway?" Brandon asked hopefully. Michael looked towards the horizon. "Not yet." "How much further?" Michael rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "A long way." Below them, hundreds of souls settled into another restless night inside the crowded hold. Above them, the great sail strained against the western wind. The voyage had lasted only 1 week. 11 remained. And although none of the passengers knew it yet, for some aboard that ship, America would remain forever beyond the horizon. Week 2. The second week at sea began with a storm. Not the kind Brandon had imagined when he dreamed of adventures on the ocean, but a relentless assault that seemed determined to tear the old ship apart, plank by plank. The wind arrived first, screaming through the rigging like something alive. Then came the waves. They struck the hull with such force that every impact echoed through the timber like the blow of a giant hammer. Deep in the emigrant hold, there was no view of the sea, only darkness, the violent rolling of the ship, and the constant fear that the next crash might be the one that sent them to the bottom. Mary held little Mary Jr. tightly against her chest, while Sean buried his face in his mother's skirt. Even Michael, who had spent years fishing the coast of County Kerry, had never experienced the Atlantic in such a mood. The lanterns swung wildly overhead before the crew extinguished them for safety, leaving the passengers in near total darkness. Only the occasional flash of lightning, slipping through cracks in the deck, reminded them that the world still existed outside. The storm lasted 3 days, and for much of that time no one was permitted on deck. The hatch remained closed to prevent waves from flooding the hold. Without fresh air, the atmosphere below was almost unbearable. The heat from hundreds of bodies, mixed with damp clothing, seasickness, smoke from the cooking stove that lingered after meals, and the stale smell of human waste. The children began to complain that they could hardly breathe. Many adults felt the same. Nearly everyone was seasick. People who had eaten little since leaving Ireland somehow found more to vomit. Buckets filled quickly. Some overflowed as the ship lurched violently from side to side. There was no possibility of cleaning the floor properly. Each morning the mess simply spread a little further beneath everyone's feet. Mary spent hours trying to keep the children on the driest patch of timber. It was an impossible task. Everything felt wet. Blankets remained damp, clothing remained damp. Even the biscuit they ate seemed to absorb moisture from the air before it reached their mouths. On the fourth day, the weather eased enough for the hatch to be opened. Fresh Atlantic air rushed into the hold like a blessing. Passengers climbed onto the deck in silence, each taking great gulps of clean air, as though they had been drowning. Some simply stood with their faces lifted towards the sky, others cried openly. Michael watched sailors pumping seawater over the deck to wash away the filth left by the storm. He wished someone could do the same below. Instead, the emigrants themselves scrubbed what little they could, using seawater and worn pieces of cloth. Salt water removed some of the dirt, but it left the timber sticky and white with salt as it dried. Fresh water was far too precious for washing. Every barrel was guarded carefully. The crew measured each family's daily allowance with strict precision. One afternoon, a young man protested that his wife needed more water because she was nursing an infant. The mate refused. "There will be none left for anyone if I make exceptions." The argument ended quickly. Everyone knew the captain would sooner throw a troublesome passenger overboard than allow disorder to spread among so many frightened people. Michael said nothing. He understood both men. The water had to last, yet every parent looked at their children and wished for just one more cup. By now the salted beef had become almost impossible to eat. It was tough, heavily salted, and often carried a smell that made the children wrinkle their noses. Mary boiled it with oatmeal whenever she could, hoping to soften it. The resulting broth was thin, but at least it was warm. Warmth had become almost as valuable as food. Nights on the Atlantic were colder than anyone had expected. The damp crept into aching joints and settled deep in people's chests. The coughing had become constant. It echoed throughout the hold, day and night. One cough became 2, 2 became 20. No one could escape it. The ship's surgeon, a title that suggested far greater resources than he actually possessed, walked slowly through the berths each morning. His medical chest contained little more than bandages, a few herbal tinctures, castor oil, laudanum for pain, and basic surgical instruments. There were no antibiotics, no intravenous fluids, no understanding of viruses. His greatest weapon against disease was hope. He paused beside an elderly woman whose breathing had become laboured. He felt her forehead, checked her pulse, listened to her chest, then quietly moved on. There was very little else he could do. Brandon watched him leave. "Will he make her better?" he whispered. Michael hesitated. "I think he'll try." It was an honest answer. Among the passengers travelled a schoolteacher from County Clare named Patrick Donnelly. Each evening he gathered whatever children still had the energy to sit together. Using a small piece of charcoal, he wrote letters of the alphabet onto a scrap of smooth wood. He taught them sums, spelling, stories from Irish history. For an hour each day the hold became something other than a floating prison. The children laughed again. Even the adults listened. Education, Patrick believed, weighed nothing in a sea chest, but could carry a person further than any ship. Mary often watched Brandon helping little Mary Jr. repeat the letters. He had become quieter since leaving Ireland. The excitement of the voyage had faded. Now he rarely asked when they would arrive. Instead, he asked what America would be like. Would there be enough food? Would people speak as they did at home? Would they ever see County Kerry again? Michael answered as best as he could. Sometimes he admitted he didn't know. Late on the final evening of the second week, a sailor shouted from the masthead, "Dolphins!" Passengers crowded carefully along the rail. A pod of dolphins raced alongside the ship, leaping effortlessly through the waves as though escorting the weary immigrants westward. For the first time in days, genuine smiles appeared. Sean laughed aloud. Little Mary Jr. clapped her hands. Even the sailors paused to watch. For a few precious minutes, sickness, hunger, and fear were forgotten. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the dolphins disappeared beneath the darkening sea. The passengers drifted quietly back below deck. The coughing resumed. The smell returned. The lanterns dimmed. Another week had passed. The Atlantic still stretched endlessly before them. But somewhere beyond that distant horizon lay the hope that had brought every soul aboard this weary ship. For now, hope remained stronger than despair. It had to, because the ocean offered nothing else.